No more restaurant revitalization fund, no more fridge no more, and what was hip about hip? That's all ahead on this week's Monday Minute. Monday Minute works like this. We're going to ask each other 5 questions about 5 headlines from the last couple of weeks. Are you ready? Let's go.
All right, Carl, the first one's for you. BUYK and Fridge No More shut down last week. Is that a sign of things to come or just something that's going on in the
Clearly, a lot of this is attributed to the war in Ukraine, and where startups have key backers from Russian investors. You're going to perhaps see more of this. Supposedly, DoorDash were going to be on the cusp of acquiring Fridge No More later this month. So this really has become quite unfortunate timing for the New York-based startup. They launched back in October 2020, so they're one of the first ones to get into this space. Similarly, BUYK were announced as a partner to Grubhub just 2 weeks ago. I guess this is a knock-on effect, really, of the sanctions and those kind of things that are affecting people beyond those that are being targeted through the sanctions. I haven't heard anything that links this back to specific oligarchs that back Putin, but clearly anything attributed to Russian commerce is being treated with caution and reluctance given the current atrocities in the Ukraine. And so startups with Russian backers, no matter how smart the idea, I think are going to be caught up in this alongside many of the founding teams that have placed their hopes and dreams of compensation through equity plans and the like. And I think my concerns right now are for the hundreds of employees that are affected through this. And hopefully they're going to be able to bring their experience into the ultra fast fulfillment space, perhaps go and work at a GoPuff or a Getir. And of course, those are clearly environments right now which continue to grow.
So it sounds like you still believe in the space.
Yeah, I was going to say, that has raised questions about the business model. There's been a lot of commentary right now about these ventures, but in a similar way, Meredith, this is like DoorDash's started, right? It was, yes, a lot of venture capital backed support. And a lot of folks are saying the problem is none of those companies are making money either right now. And so I think what we'll see is that a lot of this fulfillment area is going to continue to be acquired, much like we've seen with the smaller marketplaces. And as we're starting to see with DoorDash's and Uber Eats playing in this environment, we'll continue to see them take advantage of their current logistics fleet, as opposed to having different entities working with different logistics fleets. So I still think there's going to be a consumer need for this, but has the business model really been perfected at this point? Maybe not, but I still think we're going to see a lot of excitement in this area. Okay, the next question we've got this week is about some disappointing news. Congress has dashed any chance of the Restaurant Revitalization Fund restarting. So, what do you make of this?
I think Congress really had no other choice. We're all going back to our quote unquote normal lives and running around with vaccines and no masks. And so it's hard to make an argument that restaurants are still being affected by the coronavirus pandemic. You add on top of that all of the inflation that's occurring. And if the government were to say, we are going to give more money to a sector that probably isn't hurting anymore, they would certainly hear about it from their constituents. So it's easy to understand how Congress ended up here. I think it's a little bit harder for the independent restaurants who are affected by it. There are many independent restaurants that will never reopen post-pandemic. There are many who are still struggling to pay back the loans and personal indebtedness that they took on to make it through the pandemic. So this is certainly disappointing news for that. It was interesting when we were in Spain, there were a number of people who said over there that the restaurants that closed were probably the restaurants that were struggling anyway and maybe shouldn't be around. I think that's a very interesting line of thinking. I don't know that I totally agree with it, knowing a few restaurants who've struggled through the pandemic. But it is certainly something that for overall industry health, if you look past the unfortunate ones that didn't make it, for overall industry health, it's probably a good thing, right? There are fewer restaurants, those restaurants that they are much stronger. And the ones that remain, I think, are much more digital, which we, of course, would say is the future for restaurants. All right. Gas prices pretty high this week, Carl. I don't know. You with your electric car probably haven't noticed, but indeed they have shot up following what's going on in Ukraine, and it's starting to affect the gig workers. Tell us about that.
From my old oil and gas days when I was pricing gasoline in the UK, I try to keep a close eye on this one, Meredith. And obviously, the geopolitical landscape certainly does affect the gas pump. First of all, this hits many different mainstream news outlets. It's been all over the news this week. And there's one article that we've included below which talks about a lady called Eliza Zabaleta, who's a Lyft driver. And she said over 5 hours, she earned $100. She had to give up $55 of that to pay for gas. And she's based in California, where they're paying, according to the AAA, $5.57 a gallon right now. So it's certainly something that is concerning a lot of folks that are gig workers. And of course, I refer to a Lyft driver there because it is all gig workers. It's not just those that are helping the food delivery space. There was another article about someone called Rondo Gant, and they mix up their day between Lyft and DoorDash. And he's a former maths teacher. And what he said is, based on current gas prices, any trip over 2 miles, he needs to make at least $3 per mile. And he's therefore basing himself now close to different segments and clusters of restaurants where he knows he can pick up regularly to save himself the ride time to the restaurants. So a few things here. Great tip from him, but also perhaps ghost kitchens could be a great place, a great hub for drivers. That's something we obviously remember from our Kitchen United days that we tried to encourage. And this isn't just about gig riders. The other piece here is restaurants are going to have to think about how this is affecting their teams. What are they doing to make getting to and from work easier for their employees? For too long, that hasn't really been considered part of the benefits of working at a restaurant. But I suspect the labour crisis will deepen further if owner-operators don't proactively find ways to help their employees in that regard. And then one last thing, surcharges, much like we see on Uber, when things get busy, may become part of the restaurant space too. When I was coming back from Spain, I was at LAX yesterday, and in the 30 minutes when I was determining which gig service to use, I saw prices rise from $95 to $250 to get us back here in Orange County. And so I think because drivers are going to become an increasingly valuable resource, customers shouldn't be surprised if their delivery ends up costing more in the next 12 months. And of course, that might therefore encourage the consumer to look at pickup orders rather than delivery too. So it's going to be a tough environment. And of course, we're not even talking about the utilities aspect of gas as well, which of course is going to only add further pressure onto restaurants and their profit margins. Okay, here's an interesting one for you, Meredith. Many naysayers think healthy food and international cuisine is a coastal elite thing and will never be more than a niche. So, should restaurants take note of what's happening in CPG and grocery? And perhaps you can take us through a few of the different examples you've seen this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard this argument. I know very well in the first part of our book, we talk about how much the consumer has changed and how that contributes to all of these digital trends. And two of the big changes with the consumer we talk about in the chapter are tastes are changing, where consumers are starting to demand greater nutrition and greater variety from an international cuisine perspective in their diets. And I have heard tons of people push back on that and say that's just because you guys live in California and the middle of the country is not like that. And most Americans, they don't want to eat this way. And they've never heard of name your cuisine type. And I just don't think that's true because we see such massive change going on in the grocery space. And for example, I will tell you that Walmart is the largest seller of organic food in the US. And for people who believe that the middle of the country and Walmart shoppers don't shop organic, I think the facts say otherwise. So, a couple of articles out this week that I thought were super interesting, all pointing in the same direction. First of all, one from Food Business News pointing out that sparkling water sales grew 24% between 2020 and 2021, expected to grow on a continual basis of well over 10% for the next 5 or so years. And what's going on there? A lot of it is consumers just trying to get sugar out of their diet. It's incredible. Then you have an article from Food Dive talking about adding probiotics as a new health claim or health benefit in a whole bunch of categories. And this one was amazing to me from a periodical called Interfish, saying that major US retailers indicate they're actually going to expand the size of their seafood department because Americans are eating more seafood. This shows you that we are changing the way that we eat, right? These are actual changes being made by actual consumers, how they spend their money, and it's starting to affect the physical real estate of retail. And then the final one is a company called We, which is a multi-ethnic food variety grocer is the way I would put it, online e-grocer, and they have raised 425 million in new funding. So between all of these articles, I would just say our consumer really is changing. Our tastes are changing here in the US, and restaurants should be looking to ride this wave, bringing new things to consumers and making sure that they're eating healthy and they're getting variety in their diet. All right, last final question, which really is a question for both of us, honestly, Carl. Last week we were in Spain, of all places, at a conference called HIP, and we both went over there to speak about the book. We saw a huge convention, basically the equivalent of the NRA show, but in Spain. 25,000 attendees, huge big hall. What did you think of it? What were your takeaways from seeing a restaurant convention in another country?
Yeah, it was great to be able to go over there, and both of us were talking to great audiences, really interested about what's happening in the US food delivery market, and just to get a copy of our book as well, of course, which was great. But there were a few things that stood out to me, Meredith. I'll be curious to see which one stood out to you too. The first one was that just the difference in pace and evolution of the Spanish market. They clearly are established marketplaces in Spain. The main one is Glovo. The diner is still very established in eating out and how dining out is part of their culture. I think the COVID pandemic has certainly created a need for delivery, but I think there's also going to be a way in which Spain also recognizes, look, this is part of our culture. And do you remember that part of our book where we talked about the amount of hours that the average person in different countries spends eating, and how the US was actually very small and places like France and Italy and Greece were actually quite large in the kind of hours per day? I think Spain is probably very similar. Now, they have 300,000 restaurants in Spain, which is crazy, right? That's 50% of the amount of restaurants that we have here in the US. And they also have a large amount of independents. About 80% of those are actually independents. And so a lot of the challenges we talk about in digitizing the US industry and how we're seeing a lot of the bigger brands and the chains lead the way, I think we're seeing a bit of delay just in the adoption of digitization as a result. Not a huge range of cuisine types appeared on Glovo. A lot of the bigger chains were represented there. In fact, the winner of the best digital restaurant group was Kentucky Fried Chicken, by the way. And I'll have to put some of the different tags of the other companies that were represented in this post as well. And one other thing I'll mention, UX. I often use this phrase, count the clicks. And I don't know whether I told this to you already, Meredith, but here we go. So on Glovo, it takes 8 clicks from you to go onto the app all the way through to actually finalizing the order. To give you an idea, on DoorDash, it's 6. And on Amazon, it's 3 clicks. So for me, that really reflected really where they're at. They're about 2 clicks behind DoorDash. It
That's
was The other thing I'd say is that it was relatively light on technology. There was representation from DeliverX, Sunday were represented there. Not a huge amount of first-party ordering variety, not a huge amount of loyalty space or data management.
no third-party providers were there.
No third-party providers. Quite a few players in the back of house tech space,
Mhm.
helping with inventory control management and that side of things. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about hospitality. The hospitality was amazing. I love that about eating out in Europe, but Madrid didn't let us down. Very cheap place to eat. And one experience that we had with Donald Burns, the restaurant coach, was actually a place called Street Show. And the reason I bring this up is that Street Show opens at 8 o'clock because they eat very late in Spain. But also we had to queue up outside at 7 o'clock just to be able to get in. And there's this huge long line for an entire hour with people just standing around. And it struck me that there's a really big opportunity for restaurants that have that kind of problem, which is, of course, a good problem, to think about, well, drink services. What if I could pay a little bit more money to come in earlier? And how do we actually help the guest experience? And that whole piece about balancing supply and demand and actually recognizing that every touch point a guest has with your restaurant, even when they're outside waiting, is an opportunity to make a difference. What did you think? What were some of the things that you enjoyed about Spain?
I answered Donald Byrne's question on the panel that I was on with him, where he said, "What's the one thing you wish would go away from the pandemic?" And I said, "Oh, QR codes that go to PDF menus. I hate that. It's terrible. There you are. You get your phone out, it goes to the menu, and it's meant for a big legal size sheet of paper. And so you blow it up, you can't see it, and then it's all pixelated. It's terrible. That just needs to go away." And there were 3 companies, 2 companies at HIP, and then another one who does it here in the US, who get rid of this. And I think that's great because I really do think that is one of the worst things that happened to us in the pandemic, aside from all the restaurant closures. And so there's a company called Sunday, which you already referred to, DeliverAct, which you referred to, that had QR codes going straight to a shopping cart environment. So the online menu and then ability to check out there. Olo also offers that here in the US. To me, that represents the opportunity to blend this sort of off-premise digital delivery world with the on-premise world. And you can still go in and have a great social experience, but maybe do it in a bit more seamless way. So I think that was probably the neatest thing that I saw there. And then I also was very struck by the lack of tech at the show. If you go to any US show now, it feels like about half of it is tech people. Many shows, we went to one last summer where there were probably more tech companies trying to sell to the restaurants than there were restaurants themselves. And at this convention, there were 3 separate vendor halls and only one little aisle of tech companies, which was, I think, very telling in terms of how far along the Spanish market is in the adoption of all this stuff. The final thing I would say is we had a ton of, first of all, fans. So thank you. That was pretty rewarding and neat to see that our book was popular with folks in a whole other country. But second of all, a lot of requests to translate into Spanish. And we've also gotten requests to translate into Portuguese and to Mandarin. And while I don't speak any of those languages well enough to talk about restaurant digitization and those, if you're not going to read the audiobook, yeah, if anyone out there would like to translate them, I'm all ears.
Good stuff. All right. Thank you again to the organizers at HIP, which is Hospitality Innovation Planet. If you're over in Spain next year, definitely recommend you check it out. It's certainly a great conference. If you love food and restaurants, the guys there put on a great show. But that's it for this week's Monday Minute. Sorry we've gone over time a little bit, but we had lots to talk about. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed today's edition. I'd love to hear what you think about what's going on. If you think we have covered the right articles, what things you'd like us to cover, perhaps in a future edition. As always, put those in the comments below. And remember to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast channels and, of course, through social media at learn.delivery. Thanks as always for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. The Monday Minute is available for you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Watch us on YouTube and follow us on all our social media Learn.Delivery channels. Thanks for listening.